There's something people often misunderstand about Generation X. They call them distant, guarded, hard to read. The kind of people who say, "I'm fine," even when they're clearly carrying too much. But that distance is not always coldness, and that silence is not always pride. More often it's conditioning, because Gen X did not simply grow up in a tougher world. They grew up in a world that quietly taught them one lesson over and over again: handle it yourself. And after enough years of hearing that message without anyone saying it out loud, asking for help doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels unnatural. Let's start with a simple image. It's late afternoon. You come home from school, open the front door with your own key, step into an empty house, and close the door behind you. No one asks how your day was. No one is standing in the kitchen ready to notice the look on your face. No one sees that you're upset, confused, embarrassed, or overwhelmed. There is homework to do. Maybe chores, maybe dinner to start, maybe younger siblings to keep an eye on. And whatever happened that day at school, whatever went wrong, whatever hurt your feelings, it has to wait. Or, more accurately, it has to go somewhere inside you. Because there's no immediate audience for it, no emotional processing, no check-in, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the feeling that life keeps moving whether you are ready or not. That was not unusual for Gen X. That was normal. They were the generation of unlocked afternoons, unsupervised time, and practical independence. The world around them did not revolve around their inner state, and that shaped them deeply. When a child repeatedly learns that their struggles will not be automatically noticed, they adapt. They stop expecting rescue. They start scanning for solutions instead of support. They become competent early, not because they are naturally fearless, but because there is often no other option. Over time, self-reliance stops being a skill and becomes an identity. And once that identity hardens, asking for help can feel like betraying the only thing that ever made you feel safe. Now, imagine being 10 years old and something goes wrong. You forgot an assignment. You got into a fight with a friend. You fell off your bike and scraped your knee open. Maybe you tried to fix something and made it worse. Maybe you came home upset about something someone said. In many Gen X households, the response was rarely emotional excavation. It was practical. You'll be okay? Walk it off. Figure it out. Be careful next time. Those phrases were not always cruel. Sometimes they were just the language of adults who were themselves raised to keep moving. But to a child, repetition becomes philosophy. And the philosophy Gen X absorbed was simple. Pain is not something you present. Pain is something you manage, quietly, privately, without making it everyone else's problem. That matters more than people realize. Because children do not only learn how to solve problems, they learn what kind of problems are allowed to be shared. And Gen X learned early that physical tasks could be visible, but emotional struggle often stayed off stage. You could fix a bike chain, mow the lawn, carry groceries, babysit your brother, take responsibility. But if you felt anxious, lonely, ashamed, confused, or overwhelmed, there was rarely a cultural script inviting you to bring that into the room. So many of them got very good at translating emotional distress into action. Keep busy, work harder, stay useful. Don't talk too much, don't fall apart, don't need too much. And definitely don't expect someone else to carry what you should be carrying yourself. That's one of the keys to understanding why Gen X rarely asks for help. It's not just that they want to look strong, it's that, for many of them, competence became the acceptable face of distress. They learned to function while tired, function while sad, function while overwhelmed, function while grieving, function while uncertain. In fact, the more difficult life became, the more some of them doubled down on functioning. Because if your nervous system was built in an environment where vulnerability was rarely met with immediate comfort, then your first instinct in pain is not outreach, it is containment. And then there's privacy. Gen X grew up in a world where not everything was shared. Not every conflict became a discussion. Not every feeling became a public statement. Not every bad day needed witnesses. There was a kind of emotional privacy built into everyday life. You could go into your room and be upset without broadcasting it. You could struggle with something internally and never post, text, or announce it. That privacy gave people space, but it also created habits. Many Gen X adults still feel, almost in their bones, that some problems should stay inside the house, or inside the self. They may want connection, but they often feel a strange resistance to exposing too much too soon. Asking for help can feel less like reaching out and more like crossing a line they were trained not to cross. And underneath that resistance, there is often another belief, a quieter one, a heavier one. The belief that needing help makes you a burden, not because anyone sat them down and said those exact words, but because the emotional atmosphere around them often implied it. Adults were busy, stressed, working, distracted, dealing with their own lives, sometimes divorced, sometimes emotionally unavailable, sometimes simply tired. And children are extraordinarily sensitive to what takes up space in a household. Many Gen X kids learn to minimize themselves not through direct rejection, but through observation. They noticed when adults were stretched thin. They noticed what got attention and what did not. They noticed that being low maintenance made life smoother. So they adapted. They became easy, independent, undemanding. And later, as adults, that same adaptation often shows up as silence. I don't want to bother anyone. It's not that serious. Other people have it worse. I'll deal with it. What sounds like maturity is sometimes an old survival strategy wearing a respectable face. There is also the matter of trust. Gen X grew up during a period of cultural transition. Institutions felt less solid, families shifted, divorce rates rose, cynicism entered the room. Many of them developed a sharp radar for disappointment. They learned that authority figures were not always reliable, systems were not always kind, and promises were not always kept. So, when life gets hard, they often do not naturally assume that help will be effective, available, or safe. If experience taught you that support is inconsistent, then self-reliance does not just feel noble, it feels efficient. Why ask, explain, expose, and hope when you could just carry it yourself and avoid the risk of being let down? You can see this in the way many Gen X adults approach practical problems. They troubleshoot first, research first, endure first. They will spend hours trying to fix something on their own before calling anyone. They will carry stress quietly for months before admitting they are drowning. They will reorganize schedules, absorb extra work, ignore symptoms, postpone conversations, and tell themselves they are handling it. And often, from the outside, it looks like they are. That's the thing. Gen X can look remarkably composed while under pressure. They can remain functional in the middle of emotional storms. They can show up, keep going, and stay useful. But that strength has a hidden cost, because when someone is good at enduring, the world often assumes they need less care. And when the world assumes the long enough, they may start believing it too. Think about the emotional language available to many of them growing up. Boys, especially, were often taught that softness invited trouble. Girls were often expected to be resilient, practical, and emotionally accommodating. Across the board, there was less vocabulary for inner struggle, fewer conversations about boundaries, burnout, trauma, or mental health, fewer models for saying, "I need support," without sounding weak, dramatic, or selfish. So a lot of Gen X didn't just learn not to ask for help. They learned not to recognize certain kinds of need until those needs became impossible to ignore. By the time they admit something is wrong, it is often very wrong. Not because they are dishonest, but because they have spent decades normalizing strain. And yet, this same conditioning is also why they are often the people others lean on. They know how to stay calm in chaos. They know how to keep moving when things break. They know how to improvise. They know how to survive discomfort without immediately collapsing. They often become the reliable friend, the steady coworker, the parent who handles the crisis, the sibling who quietly takes care of everything. They can be astonishingly capable. But sometimes the most capable person in the room is also the least likely to say, "I can't do this alone." Not because they never need help, but because somewhere deep down, they still associate asking with failure, dependence, exposure, or shame. There is another layer here too. Many Gen X adults do not ask for help because they genuinely do not know what good help feels like. They know advice. They know criticism. They know being told to toughen up. They know being compared to someone who has it harder. They know being expected to manage. But being met gently, clearly, consistently, without judgment, for some, that still feels unfamiliar. And human beings tend to avoid what feels unfamiliar, even when it is good for them. So they stay in the territory they know best: endurance, self-management, silence. That is why modern culture can be so strange for them. Today, people are encouraged to speak up, share feelings, ask for support, name their needs, and reject silent suffering. And on one level, many Gen X adults understand that this is healthier. They may even believe it intellectually, but the body remembers older rules. The nervous system remembers the years when struggle was handled privately, when asking was risky, when competence was safer than vulnerability. So even when they want support, another part of them says, don't make a scene, don't depend too much, don't hand someone the power to disappoint you. And that tension can make them hard to read, because Gen X often sends mixed signals. They may want someone to notice, but feel uncomfortable when they are noticed. They may want support, but reject it when it arrives too quickly. They may be desperate for relief, yet answer every sincere question with, I'm good. They may carry pain in ways that look like discipline, humor, withdrawal, overwork, irritability, or emotional flatness. And unless you understand the psychology underneath it, it is easy to misread them, easy to call them closed off, easy to assume they do not need much, easy to miss the fact that many of them were shaped by a childhood where needing less was one of the safest roles available. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is this. Their silence is not proof that they are unaffected. It is proof that they learned very early how to keep going while affected. They learned to carry discomfort without announcing it, to survive confusion without collapsing outwardly, to handle things alone, because, for a long time, alone was the setting in which they were forced to grow. That kind of training creates adults who can endure an incredible amount. But it can also create adults who wait too long to reach for a hand that might actually help. So, why does Generation X rarely ask for help? Because many of them were raised in a culture that rewarded self-sufficiency, minimized emotional expression, normalized silent struggle, and taught them that being easy to manage was safer than being deeply known, because they were trusted with too much too early and praised for coping before they had words for what coping cost. Because when life first overwhelmed them, the answer was often not comfort. It was adjustment, endurance, independence. And decades later, that lesson is still living inside them. Not always as strength, not always as damage, usually as both. That is the real psychology of Gen X. They do not avoid asking for help because they feel nothing. They avoid asking because they were shaped in a world that taught them again and again that the most reliable person coming to save them would have to be themselves.